Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Wellness Wise webinar, Evaluating Workplace Wellness, how to ensure your investment is hitting the mark. My name is Katrina Walton, and I'm founder and director of Wellness Designs. We're a boutique workplace wellness business. We specialise in strategic consultancy, speaking and training services. We're also very much a believer in surrounding ourselves with people that inspire us, that challenge us, and also ultimately bring out our best, which is why we're also excited the last 2 weeks to announce the launch of our new Wellness Wise Academy faculty. And they consist of a range of thought leaders across a range of wellness disciplines, including the likes of workplace design, of digital technologies, of organisational psychology. And we've had the great privilege of having a number of our faculty members previously present on this Wellness Wise webinar series, including the likes of Sarah Fazell, Audrey McGibbon, Jeff Hillman, and also Melissa Marston. So if you did miss their webinars, they're still available on our Wellness Designs website under the free resources section. So I certainly encourage you to stop by and check those out and tune into some of those insights. So today we're very excited to formally welcome another one of our Wellness Wise Academy faculty members, Dr. Angela Martin. And Dr. Martin will be talking about all things workplace wellness evaluation. And evaluation is unsurprisingly critical to getting results from your wellness strategy. But despite this, recent Australian research suggests that 12% of Australian workplaces actually don't take the time to measure the impacts of their workplace wellness efforts. So why is this the case? So in this webinar, we'll delve into some of the reasons, including some of the barriers, some of the frustrations, and also where people can go wrong. And that includes often looking for that quick fix. And we'll also leave you with some key questions to ask yourselves, your team, and also potentially providers as to how you may be approaching evaluation currently around your workplace wellness efforts. So before we introduce Angela, I just wanted to go into a little bit of housekeeping on how to get the most out of this webinar today. A chance to check your settings if you can't hear or see us quite as clearly as you'd like. We'll also be taking some questions throughout, and they'll be answered at the end by Angela, but feel free to submit those as we go in the Q&A box that you'll find on the navigation bar. And if you do need to chat to us at any time with the organisers of the event, you can just drop us a note in the chat bar as well. At the end of the webinar, we will send you a link to the recording from today's webinar, together with just a brief survey, just a couple of questions as to how you found the session. We'd love to hear your honest feedback and also what other hot topics you may like to tune into to the future as well. And just finally, for those that might be on Twitter, our Twitter handle for today is #WellnessWise. Would love you to share some of the wisdom as we go. So it is my great pleasure now to introduce you to Dr. Angela Martin. I had the great pleasure of connecting with Angela, I think a number of years ago now, when we were doing some work with the Tasmanian government with the public sector. And Dr. Angela Martin is highly regarded for her expertise in industrial and organisational psychology, in particular for her research on workplace mental health and developing psychological management capabilities. With over 80 peer-reviewed research papers, including evaluation studies of interventions to create healthier workplaces in small business, the public sector, and also emergency services. Angela is able to span a range of academic disciplines and also work environments. After 20 years as an academic, including appointments at 4 Australian universities, Angela developed Pracademia and has since been engaged by a range of Australian organisations seeking evidence-based approaches to their research, consulting and training needs. So it is our great pleasure to introduce Dr. Angela Martin. Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, Katrina, and good morning to everyone. I am very excited to be presenting this webinar for you, and I hope that people are able to take away some really practical things. I've probably got a lot of content, so we'll see how we go with timing. But yeah, really excited to be here this morning. Thank you. I'll hand over my slides now. I'll just share the content, make sure that's working okay. And then we'll be off. All right, that's all showing okay for everyone? Yep, excellent, thank you. So as Katrina said, the key purpose, I guess, is to tell you a little bit more about evaluation. I understand we've got quite a lot of people listening, and I imagine the expertise in this area varies quite a bit from beginner through to people that have perhaps already conducted evaluations before for their own programs or strategies, and you know, maybe some that have done it in terms of research, but I'm going to try and pitch it somewhere in the middle. But if you do get confused or you have a question, the same old sort of no dumb questions thing applies here as in the teaching classroom. So please do note any questions, and Katrina will help me go through those at the end. So just to start off with, we will be covering today, I've got probably about 35 minutes with you, why evaluation is important, why it can be overlooked, and some of the key concepts, I guess. And in particular, there's three concepts that I'd like you to take away with you about sort of forms of evaluation and how they fit together. Also, as Katrina said, I've been working in this area for a long time, and I'm going to share with you a few examples that I've come across that I have been involved with, and also some of the things that frustrate me as a subject matter expert in this area that I see happening a lot. And I guess my goal for you guys listening is to help you be more informed in terms of selecting programs and offerings and looking at what the evidence might be behind those. Or if you are providing programs yourself, starting to think about what might be good partnerships for you in getting the right kind of evaluation data that you need, I guess, to help spread the programs that you're offering. So as Katrina said, there'll be a takeaway, just a short sheet that will be distributed by email, which contains a bit of a list of questions that summarise a lot of what I'll be talking about. Okay, so why is evaluation important? Here are a couple of ideas to the World Economic Forum. Notes like Katrina found in the research she was quoting there, hardly anybody evaluates their programs. And what I'm arguing, and not just me, but around the world, is that we need to apply the same kind of rigorous measurement to evaluating our programs in health and wellbeing as we do to many other aspects of how we run organisations. So we'll put a lot of time and effort into tracking finances, customer engagement and other things that our organisations are interested in, but much less focus on what we're offering in this health and wellbeing space. And there's probably a few reasons will come up as we go about why there's not much emphasis there. But even more locally, Comcare, who, for those of you who don't know, is the Commonwealth Workers Compensation Authority, have put quite a lot of great material out there to help people start getting their heads around how to design evaluations. And there's sort of three key points about why it's important. So firstly, you know, does the program actually achieve its stated objectives? Thinking about why do you have a wellness program or strategy? What is it that you're actually trying to achieve? It can also, and this is where I think we'll spend a bit of time today, is give some insights into why it's working or not working. Again, you know, what you see is often a bit of a black box. We did this and we measured this, but a lot less focus on what happened in the middle. And also, you know, we need to be accountable in how we're spending budgets in the organisation. So, you know, we have to be accountable to senior management who's maybe investing in the programs, but we also need to think about the sustainability of our programs. And maybe we've got a tranche of funding that's come through for a 3 to 4 year, you know, program that is just starting off, but if we want to get more funding and continue to grow our efforts, we'll need to be able to report back what was achieved with the last lot. So that's just some general points about why it's important, but if you think about it in a very basic level, what else could you be spending your money on? Are you throwing the money down the drain, basically? And we need to all work together to try to establish evidence around what does work. So Katrina's going to poll now with a little question to ask you guys why you think evaluation is so often ignored.
Okay. Thanks, Angela. So what we'll get you to do, as this is an open question, so the question we'd like to pose is, why is evaluation so often ignored? And if you can just place your responses into the chat box and we'll feed them back to Angela. We've just got some coming through now. So, Angela, some of the barriers coming through or reasons: it takes time, hard to measure wellbeing, the cost and the lack of expertise. Annie has commented there, funding's always our issue. There's a lot talking about time. And resources seem to be, it's not sexy, from Amanda.
Mm-hmm.
No strategy. Too hard, from Tim, not knowing where to start. And Kathy's highlighted there, not having the relevant tools.
All very great points, and got a few more coming through.
And another different perspective there from Rachel, a sensitive nature of the information, people providing feedback can sometimes be a barrier.
Yes, that's a good one, and I will be touching briefly on things around privacy a little bit later. So in the interest of time, we'll move on and have a look what I note as my reflections on why it's not often prioritised. So it is a very commonly experienced area of difficulty, and Katrina and I have talked before about this one always ending up kind of in the too hard basket. And, you know, people want to get started, they want to be offering something, and that's great. But quite often that's going to kind of hurt them down the track when they want to try to get more funding or expand their programs or change them in some way. So yes, it is. It's very common. So hear what you're saying, everyone. Not sexy as well, because a lot of it is quite scientific. And again, if you don't have the training or background in that area, reading a published journal article on an evaluation of a program may be good bedtime reading for those who suffer from insomnia. So understand that and get that, and I guess that's part of what I'm trying to do with my business is helping take away some of that fear and complication that exists for people who don't necessarily have that training or background. One other one I come across quite a bit is that organisations, even if we had a really good plan of what we were going to do to evaluate a program, they may be either unwilling for many reasons to provide the kinds of data that we need to do a good evaluation, or in some cases it's just that they're unable to. So, you know, an example at the moment, I've been looking at how can we integrate in a certain client's offering that they're doing, how can we integrate all the data that they've got in different parts of the organisation or in really large organisations, you know, at different sites, and perhaps there's no good IT system that actually tracks some of this data that we need. So it might not even exist yet. Budget constraints is always a big one. Again, you know, budgets for evaluation can vary massively in my experience, from really small projects that maybe have cost $10,000 or $20,000 through to $1 million, really large and very scientific kinds of evaluation. But generally what I'm finding is that what's considered a rule of thumb is around 10% of your budget for the program or the strategy should be dedicated towards evaluation. That can vary if it's quite simple, you know, maybe down to around 5%, or if it's a multi-component program in a very large and complex organisation and there's a lot that needs to be known in terms of the more qualitative side of things, that could go up to around 20%. So that's just a general rule of thumb, but yeah, budget is often a barrier. Mentioned subject matter expertise. A lot of people mentioned that. So internal to the organisation, they may not have that expertise and may need to go outside. And that's when you start to be looking at what external providers of an evaluation might actually be giving you. But what I've been involved in kind of more commonly than just being an external provider is through research partnerships. And I'll give you some examples of those towards the end of the presentation. But, you know, even those partnerships can be very time consuming to set up, manage and run. So you're right, you know, you might be doing this job with, you know, half a day a week dedicated towards it. And it's going to be very difficult to decide where to put that time. So I understand that, you know, evaluation is one where there would be a steep learning curve. And the other thing, I guess, coming from my experience as an academic is that a lot of academics, probably at times including myself, have not always made their evidence very palatable to the average person. So as I said, there's a growing emphasis on the need for what we would call knowledge translation, putting evidence into practice or thinking about the key messages about evidence and just making that easier to digest for non-research trained people. So there's a couple of the reasons why it's ignored. There's many more, but they are some of the big ones that I've seen. And so I guess my key point to start now about thinking of levels of evidence. Now, again, what's in this slide here, this pyramid that looks at how we might rank different kinds of research as the top of the pyramid versus very low levels of evidence. I'm not going to go into detail on what all of these are, don't worry, the insomnia bit's not coming up now, but what I want to show you is that it does vary considerably what we would consider acceptable scientific evidence. And in reality, what I see is most of the evidence that's around in the corporate setting, outside that academic setting, tends to be the yellow and green kind of stuff. So, you know, expert reviews or, you know, just basic feedback, opinions of people in the organisation, the employees who participated, you know, other managers in the organisation. Then we've got maybe case reports and case studies. They're a pretty common and practical way to start looking at what the impact or the value of a certain program is. But if we go up to the top of the chart, what we're trying to work on in the academic setting is getting randomised controlled trials. So they come from medicine, for people who are not familiar with what they are. They're about looking at, okay, if we have Group A gets the intervention or the program and Group B doesn't, and we make sure that by randomising them, we're controlling for all sorts of other factors that might impact on the outcomes we're measuring. And then, you know, we compare the results. We might do a survey and collect some other kinds of data from the organisation, do the intervention, and then when it's finished, we'll collect some more information from them and probably, hopefully, follow them up in a period of time to see if any of those effects are maintained. So it's like comparing, you know, thinking about how they decide whether drugs are efficacious to help someone with a particular health problem. That's considered the gold standard, is the randomised controlled trial. But you know, they're very complex, expensive and difficult to do, and they do require a lot of training and expertise. So what you see maybe in some corporate settings that's probably not up at the randomised control trial level, but you might see cross-sectional studies, which is in the blue there, and that might be something as simple as taking a survey of employees in the organisation and then repeating that again later a few years down the track once your strategy's, you know, sort of been up and running for a while. So that's the cross-sectional studies idea. Pretty common, but there are, you know, a lot of problems with the methodology around that. But, you know, it's, I think, at least an attempt to look at something very systematic. But right up the top of the pyramid there, I just want to draw your attention to, in the red there, systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So this is where I spend a lot of my time working for organisations who want to know what's the evidence about, for example, mindfulness training at work. Have current projects in that area at the moment. And what we would do is look only for good randomised controlled trials or high quality longitudinal studies, which is your cohort studies. Might decide to pick up some of the cross-sectional studies because that's all there is, maybe. But we provide a really systematic review of those different sources of evidence in order to try to make some conclusions about the findings across multiple studies. The meta-analysis part, again, pretty boring for people not interested in statistics, but it tries to come up with summary effect sizes. You know, it could be that, yes, these do work, but the effect is so small that it could be considered pretty trivial. Or if you take that effect and then use some of our information from our health economist colleagues, we could see that actually in a public health way, that can have a really big impact, even if the effect seen is only quite small. So I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but it sets up a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about in terms of practical stuff later. Always coming back to this hierarchy of levels of evidence. So I said there were three sort of key things to know about when you're doing evaluation studies, or even just small e evaluation that I would call it, just actually attempting to try to understand the value that might be created by what you're doing in this employee health and wellbeing space. So efficacy evaluation, again, comes from that idea of the randomized control trials, or from, you know, things like medicine. And what that's really asking is, does this intervention, or this program, if you like, intervention's a very researchy term, does it actually work? So when you had your aims and objectives of creating a program or a strategy, it's usually involving improvement of health and wellbeing indicators. So did we see improvements is the basic question there. And, you know, in terms of the quality of methodology that's used, there are a lot of critiques around you know, how you might do efficacy evaluation. So the first one there is self-selection. So a lot of the time we are dealing with surveys, particularly when we come to these more mental wellbeing sort of concepts. They're very difficult. You know, there's no test or blood pressure test that we can use. So surveys, but self-selection is a problem. You know, we'll have the idea that we want to sample everyone in the organisation as a valid member, but the response rate will be so low. We might get, you know, we're seeing sometimes now response rates down in the 10 to 20% area. And really, to be sort of reasonably valid indicator of that population of interest, we would want to see it at least above 50%. Short duration. So a lot of the time there's studies, they might be like a 12-month pre and post, and we don't follow people up. So we don't know if, you know, they just improved a little bit because they felt good about having this training, that didn't actually produce any measurable change in their behaviours in the longer term. I've mentioned subjectivity of measures. So, you know, have you got the right measures? Are they the most valid kind of indicators that you can get? And subjectivity is not a bad thing. As I said, you know, when it comes to some things around mental well-being, we are really interested in the person's subjective experience. Statistical issues, again, if we've got, you know, sort of poor sampling techniques, we might be drawing conclusions that are quite erroneous. So one example would be when we offer a program, for example, one I've been involved in is something like, you might call it resilience training, for example. It tends to attract those sorts of people who are really open to working on their mental health and development and personal development. And what you might see is a skew in the measures that actually most people's wellbeing is pretty high. And that's correlated with them putting their hand up to do the program. Similarly with physical fitness, I'm sure you've all heard of this healthy worker effect. You offer, you know, exercise classes and things, and it's the really fit people that come along to those. So again, thinking about how you analyse that data and are the statistical techniques appropriate, I guess, is important to note. But the one I think is really most important to me is that there are so many confounding factors. When we take studies out of the lab, or we use that kind of science model in the real world, we can't track everything. Like, you know, physical scientists can put their things into a vacuum condition where they're not affected by external variables. But as we know, life in an organisation is very complex, people are very complex, and there's a whole range of what we could call confounding factors. And this might be what's actually changing the things we're measuring and not the intervention itself. So they're just a few of the kinds of critiques that you will see around methodology. And I just think, yeah, it's important to have those in mind, even if you don't need to delve into them yourself. Thinking about, at the big picture, quality of methodology, really important. So the next key, so that was efficacy evaluation. We want to know, does it work? The next key is process evaluation. And this is more about how does it work and why or why not does it work. It's not just a yes or no answer. And I guess what we're trying to do in this area is have sustainable programs where evaluation is built in from the start and it's ongoing. There's no quick fix, and you probably hear some of this from Katrina if you've been through her process in developing a strategy. You know, just thinking about this as a long game, if you like, experimenting with things, seeing how they work and improving them over time. So really with process evaluation, what I find is we can have a great plan about an intervention. One of them that I've been involved in a policing organisation had a great training program, because from qualitative research they found, you know, that leaders' skills and attitudes and capabilities in relation to mental health and wellbeing were really important, and it was something that they wanted to boost. So we looked at designing a program that suited that policing context but drew on the evidence around managers' capabilities. And then at the end of the time period, evaluated again. But what we found through the process evaluation is hardly any of those were implemented as intended. And when they were, the coverage of the leadership teams was poor. So you might have only had, you know, 5 leaders out of a hopeful group of 20 that participated. So if not everybody is getting the strategy and the plan as intended, of course it's not going to be as effective. And so another related point is the reach and participation. So this will be probably a very basic thing to look at in process evaluation, but a very important one. So if we want to engage employees who may be at increased risk of ill health, we have to see if they're actually engaging in the program. So it sounds quite basic, but actually in reality, people don't measure reach and participation. And they just say, well, it didn't work. Well, it might be because the people that you were working with were already very healthy, and they may be at a kind of a ceiling of what you're measuring. So you would make a false conclusion unless you looked at reach and participation. Other contextual factors, as I've said, that might influence the outcomes that you're looking at. So one could be something like, you know, there's a new CEO announced in the organisation around the time that the strategy and the programs are kicking off. So depending on how that goes over the next few months and how people feel about this new leadership, that could actually boost morale and some of the other things that we're looking at measuring, but it can't be attributed to the intervention itself. Or, you know, not so positive story, job losses are announced in the middle of your program, and, you know, 20% of your workforce are going to be made redundant. So even if you've got a fantastic mental health and wellbeing program, you know, those things are going to affect the kinds of outcomes that you're looking at. Also the how, and I'll show you an example in a moment about a theory of change. So what you see often is people come up with different elements to their program, but they haven't thought about which elements are theoretically leading to which changes in which outcomes. So I'll show you that in a moment. But also just for process evaluation is so valuable for us for sharing our lessons with each other and for refining and improving what we're doing. And, you know, in terms of applying problems that we found in the next version of the strategy or program, how we could resolve some of those issues. And the third key is return on investment. So what you'll see is a lot of focus in this area in particular in the commercial setting of providers selling you know, their products and trying to show that it is certainly worth spending the money on this. I think about probably 5 years ago, this was seen as the priority because there was very low engagement in general on behalf of leaders and CEOs and boards in particularly the area of mental wellbeing. So a lot of focus was put in this area about, you know, it's good for the bottom line. There will be a return on investment. And, you know, as I said, for accountability, boards and senior leaders do expect to see some of these figures. So at a basic level, it's working out what was spent on the program versus what was saved. And it can be simple and it can be complex depending on what your objectives about this ROI information are. In some cases, you will need to work with economists if you want a very robust methodology. But if it's just a matter of sort of totaling up, if it's a small scale exercise, totaling up what you've spent, and then when you, in your evaluation, see what some of the outcomes are, trying to put a cost or a dollar figure on those. So absenteeism is one, you know, there's a certain amount that absenteeism costs an organisation, and if you see a decrease in absenteeism, you've saved some money there. Mostly, I see a positive return on investment. You will see studies claiming not to have them. But generally, there is a return on investment. There'll be lots of arguments about how it's calculated. But one classic example that gets cited a lot in the mental health and wellbeing area is Beyond Blue commissioned PricewaterhouseCoopers study. And they, you know, came to the conclusion that for every dollar you spend on investing in a mentally healthy workplace, that the employer receives a $2.3 return. And I won't go into talking about methodologies there because some of that is quite complex, but as a concept, you need to be thinking about return on investment. So if I was to say the basics of evaluation are something at efficacy level, looking at did it achieve those objectives that you were trying to impact? How did it work? Why or why not did it work? And, you know, is it worth it in a financial sense? And a point on that is finance isn't everything, right? There's so much more to this around social return on investment, public health return on investment, much broader than just what your organisation will see for the money that it's spent. Okay, so they're the three keys, and I just before going on want to mention that there's also this idea of realist evaluation. If you ever go and do any study in this area, you'll find out that this realist or pragmatic evaluation approaches are becoming actually more popular, particularly in this area, because it is really hard to do clean experimental studies. So actually what I'm getting more into in this area is that it's not just what works, it's what works for whom, in what respects, to what extent, in what contexts and how. So it's a much more nuanced answer than just did this work. And I think, you know, in the next 10 years, we'll see so much more research coming through in this area, and you know, that it helps us to be able to think about the real world setting for research. There is a role for very academic scientific research, we need that, but also we don't want that to completely put off organisations trying to be able to, in their real world setting, make some attempt to try and track impacts of what they're doing or to improve what they're doing. So we need all these different types of evidence, and you may have heard the term at scale or people talking about scaling up. What that means is that you might start with some small studies, find out a few things. It might not be a randomised controlled trial, but you can find out quite a lot from some initial studies, then starting to build more systematic methodologies over time to the point that we might see large interventions at the public health level that are scaled up and really robustly evaluated. I mentioned social return on investment because I think, like what we're seeing with climate change and other very topical issues, we do need to think about the return to our society. It's not just about the bottom line of that business, although that's an important motivator, and thinking through more around the voice of beneficiaries. So in mental health, we call people with a lived experience, consumers of services. It might also involve things like, how do disabled employees feel about physical health promotion programs, a whole range of things around giving voice to who we're intending to provide the benefits to, and a lot more focus on soft benefits too. It's not just all about the hard outcomes. I've had conversations with Katrina too about, we may not see that return on investment for absenteeism, but we see a return on investment with engagement, for example. Employees feel more cared about when they're being offered great programs and the support that they need to be able to engage in them. So yes, that's just a few points there about what I consider a more pragmatic approach, and this is the area that I'm focusing on quite a lot at the moment. Okay, so a lot of questions I get asked are, well, what should I measure? There's a lot of different indicators in this area of, Katrina's business is around wellness, so that can be mental health, physical health, social well-being. It can be many different aspects, domains of assessment, if you like. But some of you who know me know I work a lot with one of the leading people in the mental health and wellbeing field, Tony LaMontagne, and he wrote about this in 2005, that if you're going to assess a workplace health and wellbeing program, you're looking to measure improvement in health behaviours, but also improvement in working conditions. This is the number one place where people go wrong. They just measure the health behaviours. They don't measure anything about the working environment or the working conditions. So you're missing half the picture already before you even start trying to track indicators of impact. The other thing that I wanted to share with you is there's now an absolute proliferation of constructs in this area. Constructs, I mean a concept with a definition. And then usually it has a measurement tool associated with it, a short survey item in many cases, or number of items. And what's happening, I think, is that everyone's using different things, so it's very difficult for us to compare. And when we come to those things like the meta-analyses that I was talking about, we can only compare the ones where people have measured a similar thing. It confuses people all the time, non-researchers always asking me what scale, measuring psychological distress, which is the best one. Some of them are licensed and commercial products that claim to have research behind them, but if you look into them, the methodology is weak. Or they're research measures that are publicly available without charge, but they've come up with 25 questions to ask people about one thing, and it's just not feasible to get that into a survey. So there isn't an easy answer. It's just being aware of what all these different trade-offs are. And as I said, we've got different kinds of data that we want to track. So there's the hard data, and that might be things that are objectively measured, and so sick leave is an example, versus soft data like survey responses, self-reported engagement at work, for example. And we've also got now a lot more trends occurring in the idea of big data. So this is coming from analytics and stuff around what we use with the internet. And this is a big trend, I think, and anyone that's in the future of work sort of area is probably much more specialised than me to talk about that, but I think we'll see a lot more happening in that area. Again, basic terminology, qualitative, talking to people, understanding the depth about something, whereas quantitative, a numerical measure. We need both types of data. Most times I would always recommend a mixed methods, or you're going to be missing really important pieces of information. Data collection versus data collation is another one that I see. So data collection would be, okay, you decide that you really do need a survey because you have never measured employees' perceptions of psychosocial risks in your organisation. So if you've never measured it, there'll be no existing data on that, and you'll have to collect it. Versus data collation, which might be, firstly, this is one that I tell people as a great one to, save investing in big surveys, is to actually map the data that they do have already, and what are the formats that they capture that in, and how are those sources of data linked, because it may be there is adequate to evaluate a program already, and it just needs to be set up so that it can be linked and analysed better. The next point I wanted to make was about lead and lag indicators. So anyone from a health and safety background is probably familiar with what that means, but for those that aren't familiar, the lead indicator might be, with a manager training program, 50% of our managers have now been through this program and have these basic capabilities, versus the lag indicator might be, up to 3 years later, looking at how employees feel about the manager's skills in dealing with their mental health concerns. But the key point is time series. So just having a one-shot pre and post is not really going to tell you a lot in the bigger picture. You want to be looking at these indicators that you've selected over a lot of time points, because as we said, lots of things can impact whether they go up or down. So a time series, having a look at analysing data once a year or twice a year, for example, over a 5-year period, will give us a time series that's a lot more telling than a single pre-post snapshot. And the other thing I think I really want to stress to you is that you should be using a guiding framework, because otherwise you're kind of just operating a bit in the dark, coming up with things, pulling out surveys here and there without a really consistent guiding approach to what you're doing. And this is probably like what Katrina is working with organisations on, and getting them to have, a really strategic approach. The framework that I use a lot in my work, I've helped to develop this, is the integrated approach to workplace mental health. So in that framework, if I'm working with an organisation to review what they're doing in the mental health area, I would say there are 3 principles in the framework. One is to protect people's mental health from being harmed by work. 2 is to promote positive mental health and keeping the well. What have you got in that space? Some of our things around engagement fit in there. And then what are you doing to respond to mental illness or to intervene early? So then, I've got 3 things that I'm looking to achieve, and then I've got 3 sets of associated metrics that would go with that. So that's how I would approach it, and always encourage people to look for a solid guiding framework that fits with their strategy, and that will make it a lot easier. Okay, I won't go through all of these. These are just lists, and it totally depends on, what it is that you're trying to impact. But these are some of the common ones that we see in studies of health and wellbeing programs in workplaces. It's important here to note that we can't really separate physical and mental health. So what I see a lot of the time is people trying to improve physical activity, which is great because that not only has physical health benefits, it has mental health benefits, but they're not looking at the mental health benefits of what they're doing. So always try to include a mix of both, and something also around the organisational environment, because that's where you get some good indicators of wellbeing as well. So some focuses on perceptions, some focuses on people's reports of their behaviours, which have bias associated with them. So others are these more what we'll call the hard data around measuring their cholesterol, for example, looking at blood pressure. Some of the stuff in stress that's really interesting at the moment is around cortisol levels. Of course, it's impacted by lots of things other than work, but it is considered a hard indicator. And interesting, at a conference I went to recently, they were collecting fingernail samples from employees because it showed chronic stress in the fingernails from cortisol that could be measured, for example. So some interesting stuff. The ROI concept that I mentioned earlier requires you to look at indicators of impact. So rather than just focusing on those health behaviours or attitudes or self-reported things that employees are doing, also need to link it to things that have economic value to the organisation. And the common ones here, I've mentioned absenteeism and sick leave, but in the safety area, for example, things around injuries, workers' comp is probably one of the biggest motivators that I see in this area. But again, people's records of some of the workers' comp information and claims are very patchy at best. Some organisations are onto it, but you know, it can be quite hard to actually get that information and start tracking it reliably. So one I've worked with, just the last point there too, again around productivity. It's quite difficult to measure, but it can be measured, and it really depends on what the organisation already has set up as its ways of tracking performance and how systematic that is. So in some cases it can be quite easy to link some of these programs to those measures of performance, but in most cases we need to rely on people's self-reports of how productive they feel. And presenteeism is becoming a lot more common and is a trend that people are trying to address. And that's the idea that we attend work when we're not well, and that impacts on our productivity. And at the moment, we can only measure that by asking people, did you go to work when you were sick? If you did, you know, tell us on this scale of 1 to 100 how productive you felt that day when you went to work sick. So we're still really developing our measures in this area. You know, it's really only been, even if we think about the academic research, probably only around 40 years of research, whereas in other fields, you know, to work out that smoking causes lung cancer may have taken 50 years. So this is much more complex and we have to be patient, but we should be using the best available, is my key point there. Okay, now this one, I don't really expect you to read all what's in the boxes underneath, but it is there for those who would like an example. This is not an example that I promote, it's kind of a random one just to illustrate a point. And that's having a program logic. This is really critical because that's when you start to think about your framework and your theory of what it is that you're trying to achieve with your program, and then how it might lead to the sorts of indicators that you're wanting to track. So if you look along the top here where we've got resources, activities and outputs, this is helps you to sort out a bit of that mess of what you might see with a scattergun approach, which is unfortunately a bit common, just grabbing bits and pieces of different programs and providers without a really structured theory of what are we doing, what are we trying to impact and how are we impacting it. So it might be good to sit and think about this with your team, try and map out the resources that are going into the program, how they're going to be used on different activities and what outputs you're expecting them to lead to. And then from those outputs, this is where we get our short and long-term impacts. And that's trying to break those down into, well, you know, what could we expect in the first 12 months? What could we expect in 3 years? What could we expect in 5 years? And a common problem is people expecting too much too soon, is all I can say there. You know, many of these things that we're trying to impact in terms of the longer term outcomes will take 3 to 5 years. So don't give up after 2 years if you're doing an evaluation and not seeing the traction that you'd like with these longer term outcomes. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time here and seeing that, as usual, I'm kind of running out of time, but I wanted to let you know about some studies that I've been involved in and give you the link there to some of my papers if you'd like to follow up on any of those. I wanted to also make the point that some of them are very structured research studies with partners conducted through National Health and Medical Research grants, and that's where the government will actually invest some money to save you as an organisation paying for all of it because they see the social value of this kind of research. So there's been those ones there, and if you'd like to read more about those, you can have a look at my publications profile. And other things that I've been doing that are out of that research grant, research project sort of mode is having a look at what people are measuring in terms of their strategy. What's the alignment like between, thinking through that program logic like I just showed you, or designing an evaluation strategy for a project. And as I said, making it pragmatic. They're not going to want to do randomized control trials. But what's the best that we could possibly do within that context? The mindfulness intervention area, again, we're doing some really interesting stuff that's quite pragmatic and works with teams. And what I see, I guess, are the common issues is this trade-off, evidence-based versus feasible, essentially. Always having that trade-off. And, it can be very hard to justify control groups in organisations. We see dropping survey response rates, bit of death by survey. We're having to come up with some other new ways of making that less onerous for people, using pulses and other new methodologies. Catty there, sometimes having people on the phone and giving them time off work to complete is something that I'm seeing work a bit better. Here we've got also some of my personal frustrations, and again, in the interests of time, I'm really happy for people to have a look at this and contact me if they would like an offline discussion of any of these issues. But what I see, this is my key point, just relying on the happy sheet. Did people like this program? Not going to cut it for you. A lot of misleading information out there, a lot of fads and fashions. Everyone's jumping on this space now to make money, which is fine because you can have a business in this area and it can be a great business. But don't rely on testimonials. That can be very dangerous, just as it can when we're thinking about, what things we spend our money on for our own personal health and well-being. Don't forget the social determinants. That's my key message. Don't measure just about employees and their behaviours. Measure your environment and the social context. Very important. If you're thinking of selecting an off-the-shelf program, do some due diligence in looking at has any evidence been collected about it, or outsource a small piece of work for someone else to check that. Ethical issues will come up around privacy. I know that was mentioned earlier on. So, making sure that you do use a very ethical approach, because employees are sensitive about privacy. And so, yes, I think we've seen some debates, and popular media jumps on every new study now that comes out to say, oh, this proves it doesn't work. If anyone is using the word scientifically proven or this proves that, it's very unlikely to be true, because there is no definitive answer or definitive statement for most research results. It has to get this real body of evidence before we are able to start making some really valid conclusions. Okay, so take-home messages I won't go through again because I think I've stressed them as I've gone through, and I really want to make sure we've got some time for questions. The handout that will be distributed will summarise a lot of what I've talked about with key questions. And yeah, I'm always open to people contacting me for offline discussion. So I will stop my share there and let Katrina ask me some questions. And thanks for the patience, everyone.
Fantastic, Angela. Yes, we have had a few questions come through as you're talking, and a call for any other further questions. So we had a question from Penny. One client currently just wants to focus on the vibe of the organisation. Would this be in line with pragmatic or realistic evaluation?
If the vibe is about the culture and, how engaged people are with work, and if it's about, general morale and things like that, that definitely can be an important indicator to be tracking. But I would want to see not just that as the only thing that's tracked. I'd want to see some of this more process evaluation of, well, where's the vibe coming from? Is the answer. Because one little program or session or even a multiple series of those could probably not be reliably considered to have created the vibe. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Angela. A question from Marion. When you were talking about the organisational outcomes, you had that list. Just some examples of workplace costs she queried there.
Workplace costs.
Yes.
So yeah, a lot of people will track workers' comp, absenteeism, as I said, productivity or presenteeism. They would be key ones that have big costs associated with them. But there's also a lot of unquantifiable costs around turnover, for example, people leaving the organisation. You might be able to put a figure on that, but some of the softer things, it's hard to figure. So, a really poor work environment might result in poorer communication, which loses clients for the business. So it can be complex, but yeah, absenteeism, productivity, and workers' comp are key.
Fantastic. Thanks, Angela. Question from Jody. What are some low-cost initiatives that have been effective, doing more on a shoestring budget or incorporating into business as usual?
Yes. So as I said, one of the first things I will ask people when I'm working with them on this is the data that they already have, making better use of what they've already got without having to necessarily spend on getting new data. If there's nothing, if the organisation, is really small, for example, doesn't track anything, then starting small, perhaps looking at some, really short and using technology to do very short pulse surveys or something like that, even at a very basic level, repeating some focus groups with different samples of people from the organisation over time doesn't necessarily have to cost a lot of money. And one study I've been involved in, I won't mention the figure, but it's pretty low. We've been able to do something quite cool with, sort of putting it into teams and then assessing how the teams go with implementing it. So again, they didn't have the money for external consultants to come in and do the provision, but they wanted to work with me just to have a little bit of information that they can collect as they go.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing the same, Angela, trends, a bit more of an audit, so to speak. And as you said, using what they've already got at hand.
Yeah.
We're seeing your earlier point, a real reluctance to do any surveys or...
Yeah, build it up over time. And the other one, I said, if there is budget, that's not necessarily the answer to the low cost question, but if there is budget, you can leverage that budget by working with external providers that can source research grants to fund a lot of the sort of basic science element of what you're doing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Angela. Question from Jason. Would you recommend the rollout of a nationwide program right away, or would you trial the program on a smaller group?
I would always say from the scaling up literature, trialing small, getting some evidence, or perhaps doing, as I said, due diligence on checking, has this program been rolled out at a big level in another country? And if it has, what did they learn and what did they find? Because people will just jump at adopting something and roll it out national without first going through that process evaluation stage, which can lead to mistakes and a waste of money.
Yeah, fantastic. And to Jodie's earlier point, Angela, if budgets are low to begin, it's a good way to get further leverage and buy-in, isn't it, if you can demonstrate in that pilot?
Definitely. Small, like I said, even that pyramid, the repeated case studies over time, they're not sort of considered scientific evidence, but they're very practical, as I said, pragmatic, can be the way to go to get started. And then if something's looking like it is having an impact, then invest the money to show, the evidence behind it. Before I forget, evidence-based and evidence-informed are different. So be careful you're not making claims as well that are about something being evidence-based when you've never actually subjected your product to a randomized control trial, for example. It might be evidence-informed from what other people have found about similar programs.
Yeah, no, great point, Angela. And a call for any further questions, and while we're just waiting for any others that might come through. Angela, I'd noted one, and you alluded to this a bit through the presentation, just given the changing nature of the global workplace, including an increased transitional and casualised workforce. I mean, the likes of millennials now, they suggest stay an average of 18 months. What do you see some of the challenges for organisations, particularly measuring long-term impact? Yes.
Again, I think that's not too bad of a challenge if you've got a multi-level approach and you're using team or work unit data as your area of focus, not on individuals. Because you'll see, in a large organisation that has, 100 work units or sites, they will vary substantially in the sort of indicators that you're tracking. So if you're focusing on that level, that's actually okay. And another point on increased casualisation, people are working more in this gig economy is what it's been called. And that whole space around independent workers, sole traders, you know, micro businesses, and how's this all working for them. To me, that's the next big trend. So we're working on that. Yeah.
Fantastic. And again, just while we're waiting on any final questions, just to also, I think something we observed in the training, Angela, I think I'd be interested in your thoughts here too, as part of that initial scoping and assessing the needs, actually asking the question of your leaders, what does success look like? You know,
absolutely.
Because
if you can't engage them in that, if it's not consistent with the strategy, they won't want to do it. So as I said, you know, the example about in the middle of the health and wellbeing study that we're running, hundreds of job losses are announced. How consistent is that redundancy program with the overall objectives of the health and wellbeing program? And that's why I know you always talk about the leadership engagement as being, you know, the driving factor of success.
Yeah. And I think to pick up on one of your other points, I think it's also the importance of balancing. I think we assume it's always a rational decision with leaders, but there's also that emotive element, and that's, we often have the phrase, you know, you tell the numbers to the CEO, the stories to the CEO. But I guess the point is you need to have that balanced approach with the harder data to have the rigor, but the storytelling element is also so powerful.
Important, yeah. So, and people's buttons are different. The moral button, the financial button, the legal button, you know, the fear. Yeah, there's all these different ways that people respond to messages. So, yeah.
I think any further questions through, Angela. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today with our listeners. We've had a great engagement throughout the webinar, and no doubt there'll be lots of conversations that continue following as well. How can people best get in contact with you, Angela, if they do have any?
Yeah, just send me an email, mainly to the Pracademia address. I'm still adjunct at the university, so that address is also, if it's easier for you to remember, the University of Tasmania. But yes, those email addresses will also be on the handout that's coming around, that will be sent around later. So yeah.
And just to add on too, so on that handout, Angela, there'll be some key questions. Did you just want to talk?
Yes, there'll be 14 sort of key questions that distill a lot of what I was talking about, that you could either ask yourselves if you're getting started and you've got a small team and you're tasked with evaluation, versus if you have an evaluation provider, making sure they are across these best practices that I've been talking about. Yeah, so you could use that in either way.
Fantastic. I'm sure that'll be a great resource for everyone to go and reflect on some of today's takeaways. So thank you again very much to Angela. Just a reminder, we will be sending a very brief evaluation of our own off the back of the webinar, just a couple of questions. We'd love to hear your honest feedback as to how you found today. Some lovely feedback coming through from Brenda. That was fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much. From Marion. This has been fantastic. So great session. So really glad that you've all gained a lot. And I know I've written a lot of notes and further reflections for us and our clients as well. So just as a little bit of a what's next, our next webinar, I guess continuing on from this theme to an extent too, will be with Dr. Judd Allen. Now we're very excited to, all the way from beautiful Vermont. Judd is a global authority on the area of how to build wellness cultures within the workplace. So he'll be presenting on the 23rd of July on how to create supportive cultural environments. Registrations for that webinar will open in the next week, so please keep an eye out for that. And also just for those that might be interested in further building the capability of their key team members to really develop, implement and evaluate a best practice health and wellness strategy. Our next round of Wellness Wise practitioner courses are coming up in Sydney, Melbourne, Auckland, Perth and Adelaide. So for further information and also to register, just visit our wellnesswiseacademy.com.au website. So thank you very much again for joining us. We hope you're feeling more Wellness Wise on the back, and we look forward to you joining us for the next webinar in July. Thank you. Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, everyone.